Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our CEO panel discussion, which is brought to you by the Sesquicentennial and Heritage Days committees. My name is Kerry Olson. I've had the pleasure of chairing the Sesquicentennial activities during the past year. In actuality, what that means is I get to work with a lot of very talented people at Mayo Clinic who actually do the work and do all the planning and events for the Sesquicentennial. I'm hoping that many of you in this room have had the opportunity to engage in those and participate in those and have enjoyed those during the year. Today, we're really coming to a close of the 150th year activities, and this is the last major event that we're having for the Sesquicentennial. This is really a very historic occasion. We're having the first ever gathering of our past and present CEOs, the physician leadership that spans almost 50 years, 1/3 of Mayo Clinic's history, all together at one time. The film that played as you entered the room today shows the physician leaders from the doctors Mayo on to today, as well as their administrative colleagues. Today's panel includes physician leaders of Mayo Clinic and the Rochester campus. You'll find more information in your printed program, and the event that we're going to have today follows a very similar format that was done for the 25th anniversary of Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville and in Arizona, as well as the 20th anniversary in Mayo Clinic Health System. I'd like to introduce the panelists first to my left. Dr. Jean Mayberry, Dr. Bob Waller, Dr. Bob Hattery, Dr. Michael Wood, Dr. Dennis Cortese, Dr. Glenn Forbes, and Dr. John Noseworthy. One of our CEOs, Hugh Smith, at the very last minute was not able to attend. We're hoping he still may be able to be here as a family member is having surgery. One of the CEOs who also cannot come today is Dr. Emerson Ward, who now lives at Charterhouse and served as our chief executive from 1964 to 1975. I'm delighted that Dr. Ward's son, Dr. Lewis Ward, and his wife, Linda Ward, can join us today. And would those two please stand and join me in a round of applause to honor their father. Thank you. Dr. Ward led Mayo Clinic during a very transformative period that included the opening of the Mayo Medical School. I was fortunate to be in that first class, going back now, I hate to admit it, but 42 years, so a long time. Dr. Ward and his colleagues reviewed 3 principles established by the Mayo brothers to ensure the long-term vitality of the Mayo Clinic, and I'd like to read to you what these are. Number 1, the continued focus on the needs of the patient first. Number 2, the continued ideal of service. Number 3, the continued interest on the part of every staff member in the professional growth of every other staff member. And then Dr. Ward proposed a 4th principle, a willingness to embrace change, something that we know happens at a very accelerated rate on a daily basis. That is really the theme of our event today. The CEOs of Mayo Clinic, 50 years of change and continuity. In the conversation that follows, we will see the timeless principles of the Mayo Clinic model of care, as well as examples of bold, transformative change, which have ensured Mayo's continued leadership. The members of this panel would be the first ones to say they didn't do it alone, that it took teamwork, the hallmark of the Mayo Clinic, and each of us have a role in the dynamic of continuity and change. Key members of that team for all these gentlemen were the chief administrative colleagues who worked with their physician leaders. The administrative team had its own panel discussion earlier today, and I'd like to ask the chief administrators to please stand so we can recognize you again. This program is being filmed for the archive and subsequent use as an educational resource. I'm sorry that due to time constraints, it's unlikely we'll be able to take any questions from the audience. It's now my pleasure, however, to welcome our panel discussion moderators, Chris Gotti, the director of the Mayo Clinic Executive Office, and Matt Dacey, director of Heritage Museum, who will moderate the panel discussion. Matt and Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Olson, and colleagues, welcome. A great pleasure to have you here today. Our first question pertains to mentoring. One thing everyone in this room has in common is a recognition of the colleagues who have inspired us in our careers. Dr. Hattery, could you please begin by explaining the unique role of mentoring?
Well, it's my pleasure to do that. It's already mentioned that Mayo is team-oriented. And part of that team, if you're an allied health staff person or an administrator or a scientist or a physician, is to learn from colleagues who are ahead of you. And they help you watch the steps go through a career. I was lucky. I had a lot of really important mentors during my career here. I can't mention every one of those. That would be impossible to do. But I do want to recognize and honor Sister Generous. You were incredibly helpful to me. I needed to understand better the history of St. Mary's Hospital. I needed to know about the culture, and who better to learn the culture from than from you, and the values. And I know, because we talked many times, you knew your staff, every one of them, the nurses, the people in doing the cooking, and you had people help you make jam, as I remember it.
Okay.
Your staff you knew. Thanks for all the mentoring you did for me. And I would just end with a comment. I hope that many of you out there are being mentored by really outstanding people, and I hope you have some mentors as good as she was. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hattery. Dr. Waller, would you like to offer your perspective on the role of Dr. Ward in your role as a physician, kind of at the bedside?
Happy to do so. I think earlier Bob Fleming spoke about the years past when physicians in training in internal medicine would see 5 patients a day in the outpatient clinic, and then those patients would be reviewed by the staff. I started here in internal medicine, and I, for 1 year, saw 5 patients a day, every day for 1 year in the clinic in 4 different specialties. That was one of the best years I ever spent in medicine. And it was due to people like Emerson Ward who mentored me in the examination, the physical examination and the history examination of patients during that time. He was kind. He showed me where I could improve. He showed me where I made mistakes. Most of you know what the carpal tunnel syndrome is in the wrist. There is something called the tarsal tunnel syndrome on the foot. Emerson Ward taught me that. Now, I don't see many foot problems anymore, but I'll never miss another tarsal tunnel syndrome, nor will I miss an umbilical hernia, which he showed me in a very gentle and kind way. So I think at the same time Emerson was in charge of the clinic, he was seeing patients, mentoring residents, and I so admired what he did for me and for the other residents at that time.
Dr. Noseworthy, Dr. Ward also provided guidance, I believe, for you even in your role today.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I had the privilege of having lunch with Dr. Ward a few months ago, and it was a delight and a privilege. And I took all kinds of notes, thankfully, because I reviewed them last night. So I'd forgotten the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th thing that he shared with me. But the first thing was, once we had greeted each other, he said, your job is to make sure that you never lose sight of the Mayo Clinic values. First thing. He said, the quality, the patients have to have that quality, respect, and so on. But he said, if you don't have the quality, you don't have the Mayo Clinic. It's absolutely extraordinary. First thing out of his mouth, 95 years old, He got right to business, and I'll never forget it.
Thanks.
Dr. Mayberry, you were involved with the sisters and the colleagues at Methodist Hospital and Mayo Clinic at a critical time when those three organizations came together as one. Could you please talk about that time and the role of the various parties?
Sure, I'll try. I remember vividly coming here as a Tennessean and growing up in rural Tennessee where we didn't have Catholic hospital in my hometown. And I was exposed very quickly to Sister Mary Bry and Sister Jen Rose and learned a great deal from them. And I will never forget it. It has lasted me for my lifetime and has lasted the Mayo Clinic for its lifetime. And we're grateful for the contributions that they have made to us and what we do, and it will live on forever.
Thank you. Dr. Noseworthy, you've also been involved in current times with some key discussions with the Franciscans. Could you please share about that?
Thank you, Matt. I will be pleased to. So 18 months or so ago, as we were beginning to review the need for Mayo Clinic to become a single licensed hospital in Rochester, that was a very tough time for all of us. It was tough for our sisters to understand that, and it wasn't an easy decision on any level. But our sisters, as they always have done, rose to the occasion, understood the need. If we're going to serve our patients' need, we had to do this for a whole host of reasons that were outside of Mayo Clinic, if you will. And I remember meeting with Sister Marilyn, who's with us, on a Friday, and we were both really hurting with what this all meant in terms of our wonderful past with the Franciscan mission and the founders' values. And on Monday, we were going to do a short conversation with the media, if you will. And I wasn't quite sure where that would go. And on Monday morning, I came in, and Sister Marilyn was looking radiant. And I said, "How was your weekend?" And she said, "I did a lot of thinking." And she said, "The sisters are all about the future and our patients." And she said, "How about this? I'll be Mother Alfred, you be Dr. Mayo, let's shake hands and create the future." I'll never forget Sister Marilyn saying that.
So an open question to all the panelists. The influence of the Sisters of St. Francis is significant on the organization, obviously. Any other perspective on their role? Dr. Forbes.
I would add that every time one of our teams did a deep dive on the values at Mayo, inevitably there were Franciscan influence that we found at the core. So when we looked at teamwork or collaboration, it was the story of Mother Albert and Father Mayo. Or if we looked at change and innovation, all we had to do is to look at the work of the Franciscans, leaving their own religious tradition to work with Mayo to form new models of integrated healthcare. Stewardship, the famous no money, no mission. And patient care, I think Franciscan model of care really speaks for itself. So every time we looked at one of the values, we find the footprint of the Franciscan influence right at its core.
Dr. Waller?
Following Dr. Mayberry out to St. Mary's Hospital, the first day we began to talk about merger with the two hospitals, and Dr. Mayberry asked Sister Jen Rose about the possibility of merger between Mayo Clinic and the hospital, and I remember her comment. She said that we'd been spending decades together in an atmosphere of trust. Why don't we just go ahead and continue with those discussions and go ahead and accomplish the merger. Gene asked me to follow him to the Mother House on Wednesday afternoons at 4 o'clock for a long time. Do you remember that, Gene? We had chocolate chip cookies and coffee.
I'll do this.
And we were to try to learn about how to maintain the Catholicity of the hospital. When the merger took place, but also it became very clear that there were so many similarities between the values of the sisters and the values of our founders that Glenn just commented on. It became so clear during the course of those conversations. I just make one other comment. Somebody, I don't remember the conversation, Sister Generose, but someone asked Sister at one time why St. Mary's Hospital wasn't built next to the Mayo Clinic down here on 2nd Street, and Sister reminded us that St. Mary's was there first.
Okay.
When I first came here as a resident at St. Mary's Hospital, many of the nurses were nuns. And as a surgical resident, I can remember being in the operating room and requesting another suture while we were closing a wound. And the scrub nurse, who was a nun, said, "Already?" And the clear implication was that I could get 3 or 4 more stitches out of what I was using before another one. And I think the importance of waste not, want not was taught to me then. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Dr. Cortez, comments about your role with the Franciscan Sisters.
Well, there's so many stories to tell, but I think I'll just go back to, it sort of links to the discussion about culture. But I think the sisters, off the bat, I came from Philadelphia, and I was out here as a medical student, and was working on the neurosurgical service. And you learned almost instantly 2 things. 1, you don't mess with the nuns. 2, the nuns' mindset was just intrinsically teamwork. And their mindset was to work together to solve problems. And over the years, I've learned how wise that was, because healthcare is a complex business. We're dealing with complexity. People have multiple problems, multiple diseases, and complexity is a lot harder to deal with than trying to solve the problem of going to the moon. The moon is just a linear problem. Complexity is interrelationships, people working with each other. And Sharon, I think Donovan made some comments about that too. And the only way you can solve problems when you're dealing with complexity is through connectivity, neural nodes, minds working together, and teamwork. And the nuns intrinsically have that. Maybe you have to have that to become a nun, I don't know, or they teach you in nun school. But whatever it is, I tell you, I picked it up right away, and it's fortunate I did, because I think I picked it up before I was contaminated by the rest of medicine. I was still just a senior in medical school at the time, taking a rotation out here. So that's the biggest thing that they left me with for the whole rest of my career. And frankly, we're still doing it. The work I'm still doing is exactly in that mode.
The topic of change, which we're all dealing with every day, Dr. Mayberry, in one of our earlier conversations, you said that change creates progress. And I don't know if you want to add to any of that from your perspective.
Well, I come from a culture that change is not good. And so I learned a great deal at Mayo. It took a long time, but I learned it implicitly. And change is good. It's good for Mayo. It's good for the world. And if it's for the better, we've got to change to make it right. And it's not easy, but it's very worthwhile.
So a lot of change involves technology. Dr. Forbes, I think you might have a thought about digitization of images and that perspective.
Well, I was fortunate to have my practice career span a large number of changes. Some were technical, some were cultural, but most of them all had some very common themes. At times, we felt that we were adapting to change at a pace that we could manage. And there were other times where we felt we were changing because if we didn't change quickly, we would become irrelevant. And part of the difficulty also is when there's a feeling that we might have had in some situations where there was a seemingly comfort level. We knew we had to change, but we were comfortable with where we were. So part of our challenge was learning not to dwell on that loss of feeling of comfort, but to be able to constantly look and promote the aspects of advantages of the new way. Now, I remember I learned this in a very dramatic way when I was leading one of our community health systems outside of Rochester. And I found myself one night standing on a stage in a high school auditorium, much like this, explaining to several hundred community members why we were needing to close their local hospital. You can imagine the impact that that had. One of the notes in the paper the next day said, well, what does he know? You know, he's an academic neuroradiologist from Rochester, and who knows what that is? And some people ask that all the time. What do you do? Yeah, that's right.
What was your answer?
Well, what we did do is I learned that we had not fully addressed the sense of loss that the community was having. And in fact, we started talking and thinking about not losing a hospital, but in fact the opportunities gained by creating a new model of a healthcare center that would be better addressing the needs of that community, bring some services the community didn't have. And the whole approach changed because we focused and got energized by the activity of what the new opportunities might lead. When we did bring computerized imaging here in Rochester, the very first day, we had a young boy lying on the x-ray table in Baldwin with an injured leg, and we were able to transmit images for the first time clinically to an orthopedic surgeon who is in Methodist, now Eisenberg, and at the same time, the images were being viewed by radiologists in the Mayo building. We accomplished in about 1 or 2 minutes, which at that time was taking usually 1 or 2 days of patient and x-ray transport. And we all immediately knew this was a step forward. But we also knew this meant changes in jobs, changes in roles, and changes in some of the habits that were long-standing from the past. But we adapted, and now those kind of things are an everyday occurrence. So I think what we really learned out of that was we were willing to try to adapt to change when we saw the need for change was clearly there. We recognized, but we didn't dwell on a loss of comfort for the old way that we might have been leaving. But we looked for ways to become energized and optimize the advantage of the new system. And as we think about this today, there are so many ways that in fact we have to show the rest of the world, if you will, about how we maintain those human values in the art of healing while we're still at the same time changing to meet all these increasing demands for increasing efficiency and increasing the value-added care. So that's where our values and our legacy, I think, will really be important.
Dr.
Let me just add to that, neuroradiology, a personal story that is just hot off the press, basically, in the last week. I've had a significant problem with the C7 disc. Currently, I'm having pain right now. But I have a true pain in the neck. Yeah, just break it around. So last week, I have a primary care doc, PM&R, physical therapist, radiologist looking at stuff, and a neurosurgeon in Jacksonville who operated on my neck about 12 years ago. And in one day, they got the MRIs, the previous records, the previous MRIs. They all reviewed them collectively together. The PM&R person was involved. And they gave me a set of recommendations on what to do. And it was all done on one day, all done virtually while they were all doing their regular work. Nothing interfered. I never went into the clinic. Nobody had to see me. They just took care of it. And Mayo never got paid for it. But that's the future. That is the future. How do you take care of patients without having to see them? You get and basically what they did was a virtual, national, off-the-floor consultations. And some of you probably been around long enough when we were doing off-the-floor consultations and then we went to specialty clinics. Well, the practice is already disintegrating that concept and going into a virtual off-the-floor nationally without seeing the patient. Think of the power of that. The power of that. So it just takes it one step further from where you were, and it was spectacular. I was stunned. I get an email back. I never even talked to him. Probably it would talk me into surgery otherwise. But it's really very, very powerful. So the practitioners are already out there doing it. It's just amazing to watch.
Other thoughts, Dr. Hattery?
Well, I'd like to just say I was excited when Dr. Noseworthy began to put this together about what we were going to talk about, change and continuity. And from my perspective, we all lived through a lot of change. And I learned a few things. It's already been commented on, but change is inevitable. And the one thing you can count on, change will change again. And you pretty soon realize you can't live in the past. You have to be a visionary and look forward. Change is complex. And I've actually often experienced, maybe you have too, change is often very stressful. And I guess what I would be saying is there's a lot of evidence that Mayo has managed and planned for change very successfully. We learned how to plan strategically, and then we learned how to plan when our plan didn't work out. That you have a plan to go forward and you want to be there, and something happens along the way and you have to find a new pathway to follow. So we do have experience, and I think a lot of that experience sits out there. And so don't be too stressed by change. Often really good things happen. And I'd also add on that I learned that success with change is dependent on some critical resources. Well, just name a few, actually. You have to understand that the most important strength you have in going forward are the people that work here. Our best resource are the allied health staff, our administrative staff, the physicians, the people in the research laboratories, but you can make it through. Appropriate staffing, boy, how often do you think about that? It's not just how good they are and how smart they are and how talented they are, but what's the right number? You know, if you're understaffed, that's not good. If you're overstaffed, that's not good either. And probably at any point in time, you don't ever have it quite right. But don't lose any hope about what the future is going to be, because you work in an incredible organization, and each of you look left and right a little bit and see the valuable people that you're sitting beside and how good they are. So don't be afraid of change. Thank you.
Dr. Cortese.
I'd like to add on that. Just this is an analogy to think about, or a metaphor. Think of D-Day. This is the 70th anniversary. We knew who the enemy was. We had leaders who were organizational leaders who prepared a vision and set the goals. That's all they did. They didn't do anything else. But they trained people, they trained the troops, and they determined the date and where we were going to land. They left it up to the operational people to work on all the tactics, logistics, who was going to land the ships, who ran the planes, etc. The people who attacked the enemy were the troops. They picked their best troops. It wasn't the worst troops. Just think what D-Day would have been like if the senior leaders micromanaged those troops. The Germans were micromanaged because they knew they had landed, but they couldn't move from closer to Calais. They waited till the leader woke up that morning. But our troops landed on the ground and all chaos broke out. Not a single plan worked out. Nothing, as Bob was alluding to. They had to self-organize, figure out what to do on the ground. All the rest of the stakeholders who were supporting the troops had only one role at that point, and that included the President of the United States. Ammunition, fuel, food, water. The troops solved the problem. Now translate that and take it over into healthcare. What's the enemy in healthcare? Bad care at high cost. Not the physicians and the providers and the nurses, as the central leadership will say, and some of our trustees feel that way. There are bad physicians and bad nurses, but that isn't the point. The only group that can solve the problem in healthcare are providers. They are the troops. Our leaders need to set the goal and say, we're going to improve healthcare and provide all the resources that are needed, even if we lose money doing it, because we'll win in the long run. So this is the message, I think, as we look at what's going on in healthcare today. Mayo Clinic can solve the problem in healthcare. You already have. The question is, you have an obligation to do it, and that's going to require change. And the troops who did this in D-Day, believe me, they were changing every 2 seconds. And they had to get through it, and they did it.
Dr. Wood.
One of the things we wanted to talk about was just teamwork and broadly, and both you and Dr. Hattery were part of the building of the Gonda building, which was a time that required tremendous teamwork. It was also a tremendous change. Would you offer perspective on the building of the Gonda building and the teamwork required associated with that?
Well, I think the Gonda building is a good thing to talk about when we're talking about continuity and change. But and they say timing is everything, and I was fortunate to be in the CEO role when the Gonda building opened. But it really started with the planning of Dr. Waller and Dr. Hattery. And I think the important thing is that that whole progress was shepherded by many, many people throughout this institution, not the least of which is Carrie Olson and Craig Smolt, who oversaw so much of the project. I think the other thing about the Gonda building, it's a good example in bricks and marble of continuity and change. Because the Gonda building, in terms of continuity, linked the Mayo building with the Charleston building to make it basically the largest single building for healthcare in the country. And the Gonda itself was about 1.5 million square feet, but I think the composite finished product was over 3 million square feet. And it was also built so that it could be multifunctional, to serve as in a hospital role or an outpatient role, to adapt to the changing practice patterns and the changing technology. I think the other thing in terms of continuity, it's almost uncanny that the architectural firm that built it was Ellerbe Beckett. And they were the same firm that built the 1914 original Mayo building, which is on the site where we're sitting right now. And John Waugh, who is the principal architect, was both the grandson and son of Mayo physicians. So that continuity, along with radical change, is kind of vividly illustrated by the Gonda building.
Dr. Hattery.
Well, if you'll permit me a little bit of humor, my wife has heard this in the past, but the only role I played that was really significant would be going through some of the plans that they would bring forward, and they were a good architectural firm, obviously, but they would honestly say, do you have any suggestions? And I said, I only have one. Put more women's bathrooms in this building. They had a formula, and it was the old formula. And I said, nope. I'm trained as a GU genital urinary radiologist, and I know you got to have more women's bathrooms. So anyway.
Dr. Waller.
Just a quick story about the Gonda building. I think, as I recall, there was a written agreement that was being worked on between Mr. Gonda's foundation and Mayo Clinic. And one time we received a call from Leslie Gonda, and he said, you know, the written agreement is getting a little bit complicated, and I'm not sure we can work out all the details about the timeline and when the money will flow. And he said, did we agree that Mayo Clinic would build this building in 4 years? And I can't recall who was on that conversation. Maybe Mike, you were as well, and Bob Hattery. And we said, yes, Mr. Gonda, we will, 48 months we'll have the building up. And he said, did I agree to give you so many dollars? I can't remember the number, a lot bigger than I've ever counted before. But he said, did we agree that I would give you so much money? Yes, sir, we agreed with that. He said, would you mind if we dispense with a written agreement and shake hands over the telephone? yes, Mr. Gondo, I think we can do that. And he said, we'll see you at the opening 4 years from now. Hung up the phone. And that just tells you about trust. And we've talked about trust with our sisters and trust with our colleagues. And this was a great man who trusted what we thought we could do. He also leased, being from Memphis, he leased some of the first planes to Fred Smith at FedEx. Fred was, of course, a trustee here, and came to Memphis to have a celebration the day that FedEx transferred 1,000 packages a day. They've moved up a little bit since then. But there was a connection between Fred Smith and Leslie Gonda as well.
Dr. Wood.
I think, Dr. Waller, that's a great segue also in terms of emphasizing how important our donors and philanthropic supporters have been in the development of our entire campus. It's true the planning for the Gonda building and the foresight occurred here on this campus, but the money to do it came from grateful patients. And those patients are grateful only because of the outstanding care they get here and the recognition that they want to see Mayo Clinic be alive and well for their children and their grandchildren and their grandchildren's children. So, and I think in terms of the Gonda building, it bears Leslie and Susan Gonda's name, but originally the building was only going to be, I think, 11 stories, and Lou Gonda, the son of Leslie Gonda, came in and said, "Well, why don't we just pop 10 more on it?" And
more money.
and he wrote the check, and even contributions from people like Dale Chihuly, who put the much of the outstanding glass work, and a lot of the artwork all came from donations from our grateful patients, and they wouldn't be grateful if it wasn't for the people in this room and across the street.
On the topic of teamwork, Dr. Waller, would you mind sharing your perspective on Dr. Sant, truly one of the icons in Mayo history?
Well, sure. There are a lot of stories about Thor Sant. I think Dennis has some, and others on the panel. Two quick ones. I remember being in some difficulty with a patient in the operating room and had what we call a cerebrospinal fluid leak, which is not something ophthalmologists are usually accustomed to. And I called the clinic. Thor was in the clinic seeing patients and asked him what to do and how we might handle it. And 10 minutes later, he was in the operating room, dropping what he had to do over in the clinic and came over and helped. That's happened multiple times. Thor is a perfect example of that, but we could cite hundreds of stories where that has taken place. What I remember most about Thor was during his last years, he had a busy surgical practice, a busy research laboratory, wrote multiple papers, had leadership roles across the nation. But in the surgeon's lounge between cases, he had photographs of all of his allied health professionals in that particular corridor of neurosurgery with their masks off and with their first names on the below their pictures so that he could remember and be sure he could call them by their first name. And there were at least 24 allied health professionals in that corridor, and he worked hard to remember those names and work with the people in that corridor. That's worth 1,000 pictures, worth 1,000 words, and what that really meant to teamwork and the culture and how important he was to them and they to him. Dennis, you have other stories about Thor?
Well, if I may, I'll just go into one. I'll go back when he started. It was 1969. As I mentioned, I came from my medical school. They allowed you to travel around the country, and I had worked 2 years with a laboratory with a neurosurgeon in Philadelphia who had trained at Mayo, and he said, you ought to go to Mayo. So I applied to Mayo. We got for a clerkship. We got accepted. My wife and I looked it up, and we figured, well, we just drive up to Rochester, New York, be no problem. It'd be a nice time. And that's actually true. And we found out it's not in Rochester, New York. It's in Minnesota. And I looked it up, and I said, that's on the other side of the Mississippi. There's Indians out there, and I wasn't sure that we can make this trip. So we drove out the Trans-Canada Highway, drive into town. I report to Collie McCarty, who I remember I was just a senior in high school. He was the nicest gentleman. He brought me in the room. He treated me like I was part of the team right off the bat. He said, you're working with Thor Sunt. So, okay, I don't know who Thor Sunt was. He had been there 6 months. He just joined Mayo Clinic. So I was Thor's second assistant, working with Shige Kobayashi. Some of you might know Shige. Never forgotten him. He's one of our honored professors now. And making rounds one night, the nurses at the second neuro unit called us in, and that's when we started to learn the nurses know what they're doing. We're making rounds. We come in about 7:30, and the nurse said, the pulse is bad in this guy's arm. We had done a brachial angiogram. And we checked the pulse, and so we came back by 10 o'clock. Yes, it really was. We were very much convinced that color was changing. We called Thor. At home, it was his patient. And as usual, the staff physician, he was in 10 minutes from his home in Weatherhill. And he arrived, and he said, we got a problem. We got to get this clot out. And he called Jim Pluth. And Jim Pluth had been there about 6 months, too. He had just arrived. And Pluth was in no time. He's talking about teamwork to help him out. By 12:30 at night, we had called Thor at 11:30. 12:30 at night, we're in the OR. The whole team came in, got the clot out, go back. Next morning, we make rounds. The patient's doing well. And Thor and Jim had never met each other before. And on rounds, Thor, you know how he used to mumble and stuff. He'd say, Jim Pluth, he's going to be a great doctor. And I said, well, why is that? He said, well, he came in when I called him. And that was it. And I learned everything I needed to know about Mayo culture on that one day. Teamwork. And people come in, you come in when you're called. And the fact that you have to, it was the whole team. You just have to picture this whole particular team. When you call, the patient comes. What was that message? Patient comes first. Second was everybody dropped what they were doing when they were asked to help out. And the team just came, and we ended up with a good result. 30 years later, just to finish the story here, 30 years later, when I started to read about them, I knew nothing about Mayo Clinic when I came here. 30 years later, I'm reading about the history of Mayo Clinic, and sure enough, there's Will Mayo sitting up there. They had hired Henry Plummer in 2001, system engineer, got the electronic record up in 1907. And then I come across his speech at the Rush Medical School in 2010, Will Mayo's speech, where he says the best interest is the only interest of the best interest of the patient is the only interest to be considered. And then there's a comma, and that in order to bring advancing knowledge to the benefit of the patient, a union of forces is necessary. The patient and teamwork. What more do we need? And that's it for me for my whole career. And Thor taught me that the first day I was here.
It looks like Hugh Smith is not going to be able to join us here. And in speaking with Hugh late last night when he anticipated that he may not be able to join, asked him what would be the one message that you would want to convey and that maybe the rest of us could also try to convey. And all of us will share this, but the thing that surfaced to the top was teamwork and collaboration in patient care. So if Hugh were here, he would tell that, and he would tell that in a way that only gregarious Hugh could really tell his own stories, which I wouldn't begin to try to copy. But I know that he was interested in trying to relate a little bit one of the stories. There are thousands. I think every one of us in this auditorium could recount numerous cases of teamwork in patient care and the impact on families and so on. But one of the ones that held a lot of the public's attention was several years ago when we had some procedures with the conjoint twins. And I don't think we're able to go into a lot of detail for confidentiality reasons about just the patient care, but I think much of it hit the public press, and I think many of us are all very aware of it. There were two aspects of that. The public aspect was this tremendous tour de force of scientific medical accomplishment. It was an incredibly technically challenging situation to deal with. That was the public's view. But I think most every one of us internally know that the real tour de force that was expressed in that particular incident was the internal collaboration and teamwork, literally of hundreds of people from just about every division and every department, more than physicians, the nurses and the technicians and everyone who had something to do with putting the teams together and working on some aspect of that particular case. It ended up in a result that did very well for the family and for the patients. Publicly was perceived as this great medical advance, but internally it really was an expression of an incredible amount of teamwork for patient care. And I know if Hugh were here, he would respond to that, and I would just want to relate that story on Hugh's behalf.
Dr. Mayberry, you've been a patient recently at Mayo Clinic that you shared one time when you went to the hospital, and you had an experience that was pretty remarkable also. Could you please tell us about that?
Well, my experience was unique to me, but I'm sure it's not unique. But late one night, being at Charterhouse, I awakened in the night. I'd had some chest pain earlier in the day with some exercise, but in the night I awakened with some chest pain, and I went back to sleep, and then pretty soon I was awakened again. And I thought, well, I better do something about this. So I called downstairs, and the ambulance took me to the hospital at St. Mary's, and there I spent a day and a little over a day, and they finally decided I could go home. But home, I'd come at night in a bathrobe, no medicine, no money, no billfold, no anything. And so when they dismissed me, there I was. Just so they, I didn't know what was going to happen, but I was at St. Mary's, and somehow or other, some money came to put in my bathrobe. And as it turned out, the money was from the head of the nurse service that I was on. And so I was absolutely touched by this, to say the least. It touched me more than anything I can just ever remember. And so when I got home and realized all the things were going on, I thought, well, I'll pay that back, and I went out to the hospital the next day when I could go out there, and found out it had been given by the head nurse on the service that I was on. And I thought, well, that just to pay the $10 wouldn't. I mean, I've got to make it more than that, even though I know that that's not clinic policy. But when you're when you're so grateful and you're so needing, you want to do something that. But it wasn't accepted. The $10 was accepted though, and so here I am, $10 later.
Dr. Waller, would you mind sharing, you mentioned a time when you had been giving a presentation and you came back to the office late at night and it showed the value of the whole team at Mayo.
I think that was after an annual meeting, and over in the Civic Auditorium, I'd given a talk, as we all have, and putting away, it was 10 o'clock at night, and I was putting away my slides back when we had slides. And ruminating about whether the tone of the speech was right, and did I say the right things, and was it worthwhile giving that talk. And I stopped by the break room, and our custodial staff was there, and they were having a snack, I guess having supper at that time. But one of them excused himself to go to a quality improvement committee meeting at 10:30 at night. And I think that Shirley earlier at the CAO meeting had talked about excellence in everything we do, trying to improve in everything that we do. And I think this was a wonderful example of how improvement within the Mayo system and teamwork and the culture of improvement is embedded and woven into the fabric of the institution. And I really felt good going home, having heard that comment from that young man who was on his way to find ways to improve what he was doing in his job and the custodial staff.
Just an open question for the panel. We've talked a lot about patient care, also teamwork. Any thoughts on those two fronts, patient care examples that stand out during your time, or teamwork examples that stand out in your memory that represent Mayo? Dr. Cortese?
I just want to follow you because you just brought one to my mind. In Jacksonville, we talk about transmitting the culture. And in Jacksonville, when we were, right after we opened our lung transplant program, our second transplant patient was one of mine who had come down from Philadelphia as a business person. In those days, you had to wait in the hospital to get your organ. And he was in for probably a month and a half, almost 2 months, waiting there. And he did work from his room, and the custodial staff in the evening would come in to try to clean up the rooms, and he was there with a pile of papers and stuff he was working on. And they asked him, what can we do to help? And he said, well, I could really use a special trash can or maybe a shredder and stuff like that. The custodial staff arranged to have that all put in the room and help him live his life while he was waiting for his lung transplant, had his lung transplant, wait home, and he made a donation in their name. He remembered them for that.
Noteworthy.
Each other here. And I keep thinking about a comment Bob Hattery has made in the past. I don't know how many times you've made it, Bob, but he has said, we are an academic, integrated, multi-specialty group practice of medicine, with emphasis on the words academic, integrated, multi-specialty group practice of medicine. And that patient care within that context, with immediate access to the collective intelligence of everybody within this institution, whether it's physician or administrator or staff, with the immediate access, whether it's the hallway consultation or whether it's the new technology that has become available to us, or whether it's a 5-digit number you can go to any phone in this clinic and find somebody in Jacksonville or Arizona or in any place within the system, is what is so unique. And I can't imagine that there's any place in the world that's like it. And the joy of being able to not feel when you're practicing medicine that you're alone. You are not alone, because you have this immediate access to the collective intelligence of a walking library, if you will, of your colleagues who are eager and willing to help, like Dennis' comment about Thor and Jim Pluth and my own experience with him and hundreds of others. We could spend the rest of the day talking about that. So I think that kind of puts it in context for me, and Bob's comment about that has always put that in context for me.
I think one of the truly unique aspects of teamwork at Mayo that you just don't see in very many other places is the teamwork between the care providers and the administrative staff. And so often they're at loggerheads to each other, trying to squeeze resources out of each other. And at Mayo, they're consistently pulling in the same direction, and for the benefit of the patient. And I can remember early on, I was interested in knowing what some of the history was of Mayo dealing with difficult times. And John Harrell, who I was working with at the time, suggested that if I want to know something about what it was like in the Depression and the pre-war period, to go over and talk to Slade Schuster, who was the chief administrator here for 18 years. He joined the Mayo in 1929, the same year as the Great Depression started. And he told me a story about that after he was here a couple of years, and Dr. Will said, you know, our patients just can't pay their bills, so we have to decrease their bills, and we have to forgive some bills, and also to do that, probably everybody has to take a pay cut. And he said, but it's just temporary. This will pass. And instead of laying people off, instead of saying you're in and you're out, everyone stayed. Everyone made a little less money. Everyone survived it. And it was just a very interesting perspective of Mr. Schuster. I think the interesting thing was he was 91 at the time, and I said, well, Slade, I'd like to come back another time and talk more about this. And he said, well, I don't think I'd wait too long on that. And as a matter of fact, he died about a month later. And I never had that other opportunity, but I was grateful for that one opportunity I had with him.
Just to quickly add, the administrators this morning talked a fair amount, and John and Sharon and Shirley and Jeff really emphasized that role. And I think from the physician leadership side, we would reinforce not only everything that was said this morning by our administrative colleagues, but to emphasize that this is one of the special criterion attributes that really distinguishes our organization, that really you don't see in hardly any other organizations. And it brings an element of shared values and common commitment to the model and real dedication to common goals. And because of that, there's a breadth in the discussion and the thinking and the decision-making from a broader range of experience. So we'd like to compliment the administrators that commented so articulately on that this morning and emphasize the same thing from our side.
As we're winding down, Dr. Noseworthy, our current leader, what are your thoughts and feelings as you hear this great panel?
Well, I want to thank you, Matt and Chris and Carrie, for pulling this together. I want to personally express my gratitude to the CEOs that are on the panel here with me today for their commitment to Mayo Clinic and your willingness to embrace change and lead boldly. But you've also comforted us that we can get through this, and you've given us wonderful examples and reasons to believe that way. Glenn reminded us to thank our administrative colleagues who, without their professionalism and insight and mentoring, we would not be able to do our job nearly as effectively. I'd also like to thank the sisters who are with us today and those who came before them for their commitment to mission, and to remind all of us how grateful we are, not only for all they've done for us, but also for endowing the Values Council so we will never lose sight of our values. It'll be embedded in this organization forever. We can't be in this room without looking at our heritage and thanking the leaders who really put this all together, and the founders' values. And with that, I look at the staff. And you look at the staff and the example that all of you provide to us every day to put the needs of the patient first, to help each other, to support each other, and to deal with change, and to make sure we change what we need to and we continue what we must. And with that, I'm incredibly confident about the future. Sure, it'll be hard, and there'll be loss, and there'll be some struggle here and there, but we will do it. The Mayo Clinic will do this. And we are so fortunate. We have to make some changes, but we have what no one else has. We have that commitment to each other, the teamwork and the cultures. And everyone else wishes they had that, and how fortunate we are. And with that, we will embrace change, and we will lead strongly going forward. That will be good for our patients, and that will be good for our staff and our future staff. So with that, I'd just like to thank all the staff for what they do every single day for our patients. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming today, and our thoughts are with Dr. Smith and Dr. Ward. And again, thank our panelists here today. It's been an outstanding opportunity to get our CEOs together and really thank them for their service, their insights, their leadership. I know that their legacy is going to live on way beyond the next 50 years. Thanks for coming today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.